Well, over the weekend, we had the heartwarming news that 3 sets of Israeli hostages have now been freed. And tonight, we're expected to finally see Hamas set free the baby who was taken hostage as a 9-month-old and is now 10 months old. This beautiful, poor, innocent baby who never did anything to deserve this disgusting capture by Hamas, who never should have spent 50 days in shocking conditions. There are now 40 women and children who are back at home with their families in Israel. The Israelis celebrated their return with crowds turning out onto the streets late at night to sing Am Yisrael Chai as they welcomed the hostages home. That song celebrating Israel, its existence and its future. Now, these reunions are heartwarming after 50 days apart, 50 days of being held in underground tunnels, away from sunshine, fresh air, wind, and the love and laughter of sibling and family and friends. 50 days under the control of brutal terrorists. 50 days not knowing whether they would ever see their loved ones again, if they'd ever return to Israel. And even when the hostages were finally freed and they were brought above ground, they didn't know if they were being transported for execution. For the adults, the trauma of knowing that a former hostage, Gilad Shalit, spent 5 years in prison made matters even worse. They know that others never made it out alive. The psychological trauma from this time for both children and adults alike will be immense. The ongoing suffering may never end, it may last their entire lives, and yet they are the lucky ones. Some 200 Israeli hostages are still being held captive by these animals, these terrorists, who are prepared to sacrifice their own civilians as human shields without a second thought. 200 innocent Israelis are still in dark, damp underground tunnels with little food. And for the sons and the brothers and the fathers, there's no plan for the release of the men. And for the Israeli soldiers, both men and women, the reality is they're most likely being tortured and they may never be released. If they are released, the price will be far higher than for the civilians. Yet a lot of the international media, including in Australia, has reported the exchange of criminals from Israeli prisons for innocent Israelis held by Hamas, as though it's some sort of equal deal. There is no equivalence here between the criminals held by Israel who have committed serious crimes, including stabbing and murder, and the innocent women, children and babies. We are seeing very clearly a terrible double standard when it comes to the treatment of Jews compared with the treatment of any other ethnicity or group in Australia. This post by Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi, where she posed for a photograph, she was smiling beside a student holding up a sign saying, "Jews should get in the bin, keep the world clean from Jews." And not just posing happily beside it, but Mehreen Faruqi uploaded the photograph to her social media account. Eventually, she deleted it. Has she apologised? Well, not that we've seen. We've asked her today if she has apologised, if so, where, and if she was planning on apologise. We've had no response. How can she not have apologised? Well, I'll tell you why. Because much of the mainstream media have simply failed to cover this story, as Paul Murray revealed on his show last night. The left media, like The Guardian and the ABC, are so obsessed with issues of equality and racism, except when it comes to Jews. And then they appear to have no problems with a senator being openly racist. How can they not think this is a big story to cover? A big story. But none of these media outlets are covering it in a major way. So why have so many journalists ignored this very obvious news story about a senator standing next to a sign saying, "Keep the world clean from Jews," when the media was, as Paul Murray pointed out last night, when the media was obsessed with Tony Abbott unwittingly standing in front of a sign that said "Ditch the Witch"? Well, you know why the journalists haven't covered it? Because about 270 of them now have signed a petition calling for reporting on this war to change, to be less sympathetic towards Israel. I don't even know how it's possible to be less sympathetic. These media outlets are already so hostile towards Israel and Jews. They don't believe Israel has a right to defend itself after a terror attack which killed 1,400 innocent Israelis and saw another 240 innocent women, children and men kidnapped and taken hostage. But these journalists don't want Israel to defend itself. Many of them were demanding a ceasefire from the very start, and they didn't express concern or post on social media about the innocent babies and children who'd been kidnapped or the women who'd been raped, the teenagers who'd been raped. And now they want the media outlets they work for to treat Hamas like Israel. Sorry, to treat Israel like Hamas. To treat claims from Israel with as much scepticism as you would treat claims from a terrorist organisation. It's unbelievable. The only comfort I can possibly take from this is that there's now a list of the journalists for the world to see, the journalists who've effectively taken a stance against Israel and the Jewish community. Their names are there in black and white. Journalists on the left have turned virtue signalling into an art. They've added pronouns to their email signatures. They've campaigned for ethnic, gender, transgender and sexual diversity in their newsrooms. But again, they don't care about racism or equality or diversity when it comes to Jews. And by the way, how many Jewish people actually work at the ABC and in the Guardian's newsroom? And for those that do, how safe do they feel in that environment? As for the media industry, they had their awards called the Walkleys on Friday night. And as you may have heard, they had a pro-Palestinian activist as co-host. And he demanded that all journalists in the room use their platform to call for a ceasefire. Now, let's be clear, a ceasefire doesn't mean peace. We had a ceasefire on October the 6th. A ceasefire means that Israel should give up on having its hostages returned, should give up on defending its right to exist, should just let its people, Jews, be slaughtered. Now, I wonder how many Jews the Walkleys have on their judging panels. How many Jews who are Zionists do they give awards to? Well, I'll tell you the answer, not many. We saw anti-Semitism at the Walkleys on Friday night, where concern was expressed for those in Gaza, but not those in Israel. Because according to the Walkleys, Jewish lives apparently don't matter. Well, former Labor Senator Stephen Conroy last night made this point about the left, that there's one rule for the Jews and another for any other minority group.
If this was in any way happening to Muslims around mosques, there will be an outcry. And Australians need to stand up, and particularly Australians who believe or think they're on the progressive left side of politics. When you walk in a march, when you stand next to people who are chanting from the river to the sea, you are calling for the extermination of the state of Israel. This is not Labor policy. This is not left policy. You are barracking for Hamas's policy.
Well, there was another brilliant column from the former editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, in the paper today. And in it, he quoted journalist Barry Weiss from a speech she gave in the wake of Hamas's attacks on Israel. Barry made this brilliant point about the social justice crowd.
Hip young people with pronouns in their bios are not just chanting the slogans of a genocidal death cult. They are going around and tearing down the photographs of women and children who are currently being held hostage in tunnels that run under the Gaza Strip. And they do so gleefully. They laugh. They mock the 9-month-old baby who was stolen from his parents. And in doing so, they are tearing down, or at least they are trying to tear down, the essence of our common humanity. It is a symptom of a much deeper crisis, one that explains how, in the span of a little over 20 years since September 11th, educated people now respond to an act of savagery not with a defense of civilization, but with a defense of barbarism.
Such a good point. The left has tied itself in knots and has somehow turned innocent victims into oppressors, and has somehow sided with the terrorists who, if allowed, would continue to inflict brutal and unbearable acts of cruelty against Jewish people, not just in Israel, but all over the world. And then after the Jews, it would be anyone who doesn't believe in Islam and doesn't follow their radical rule. The terrorists don't hide this ambition, they boast about it. But none of the woke left seem to care about their murderous intent. Instead, they celebrate it in rallies on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. And a Greens politician smiles beside an Australian girl holding a sign that says she wants to keep the world clean from Jews. A message from Hamas endorsed by a politician in a mainstream political party. And most of the media don't even blink. They don't think it's worth reporting on. The Prime Minister doesn't condemn it, and that's how anti-Semitism becomes normalised and part of the fabric of Australian life.